Okay.
All right, so we've started recording today's talk with Craig LeHoullier. He's going to tell us about uh, bringing your garden to the sun, growing plants in containers and straw bales.
Great. Well,
Thank you,
thank you
Craig.
very much. Thank you, Charlotte. And this is a treat to be here. And what I want to do is start right here. I always like to start my talks by showing what's happening in my yard at the moment. And I know this is kind of crazy. We went from doing all of my gardening in Raleigh on a driveway, which you'll see, to having this big quarter-acre yard that's fenced in. So we've created an obstacle course for our two dogs. And it is also a place where I'm putting straw bales and containers with lots of different things, and we'll talk about that. But I want to plant a seed with everyone, no pun intended, of just the great potential to expand not only what each one of us on this call grow, but expand the pool of gardeners out there by understanding the different concepts to be able to succeed with containers and straw bales. So everything on this table, and these are tomatoes that some of them go for £1.50 up to 2 pounds, all grown in either straw bales or containers. All of the eggplant and in this shot were grown in straw bales and containers. And in fact, one of the things I'll want to remember to relate to you is that for those who have been disappointed with yields of particularly bell peppers and eggplant grown in the soil, where the roots are quite cool because of that clay, your yields will go up at least tenfold when you raise those roots and grow them above ground in containers or straw bales. All of these types of peppers. It's just been a remarkable experience to see my gardens explode with this, and I'll show why I went this way in a moment. Green beans, summer squash, that's one of my favorite varieties, Zephyr, with a little green tip. Cucumbers, all in containers or straw bales. So where did this idea all come from? Well, this is the house that we lived in Raleigh for 28 years. And when we moved in, I hand dug that big 30 by 50 foot plot. I learned that gardening in North Carolina would be quite different from gardening in Pennsylvania, because there I could shove my hand into the ground up to my shoulder. Here, I broke my fist when I tried to punch the soil. So we have rocks, we have clay, all sorts of stuff. But it was okay because, as you all know, when you work good nutritional materials into clay, it holds those nutrients, and if you can get decent drainage, you can have great gardens. However, tulip poplars, loblolly pines, as we lived in this house, they grew and reduced the amount of sun in the yard to the point where we were just getting miserable performance. So what does one do? They look in their yard to see where the sun is shining, and lo and behold, the sun was shining in my driveway. So I found that over the years, maybe a 10-year period, I could pick a ton of produce for my driveway. Maybe there would be 200, 250 containers. I'd have tomatoes and peppers and eggplant, and then worked in things like zucchini and cucumbers. Yes, there was a bit of watering involved because this is a driveway, and I did not take the effort or time or disruption or cost to set up a drip irrigation system. So I was the drip that provided the irrigation. However, one of the wonderful things about people who have this passion for gardening, and this is something that I'm trying to embed in all of the people who are joining gardening because of COVID, is that the joy in it is spending time every day with your plants and getting to know your plants when they're happy, when they're struggling. So this actually worked out just fine. But here I am in my backyard, in my Hendersonville garden, and in the back you'll see a raised bed. That's a form of container gardening. You'll see I've got straw bales laid down, and they're string up and flat. The one, as you're looking at the picture, the left is our 4 bales budded together for bush beans, and the one at the edge of the picture to the right budded together are 4 bales for the squash and the cucumbers. So we're really happy here. Anybody who has looked at my Instagram thread can probably figure that out. So why would we want to go to straw bales and containers anyway? And this was really exhibited recently. I'm not sure about Wake County, Durham County, Raleigh, out east, the center of the state, but Hendersonville, up until about a week ago, has been nonstop rain. And we drive around and we look at some of the fields that haven't been planted yet. And the reason they haven't been planted is because they're underwater. A few years ago in my Raleigh garden, maybe about 2013-14, when we were doing photography for Epic Tomatoes, I asked my daughter, Caitlin, who likes to exercise, to dig me some holes for my tomatoes. And we had a thunderstorm. And the next day, this is what I saw. So this is what happens with poorly draining soil. And for most crops, they hate wet feet. With straw bales and containers, my plants are doing great because anybody in traditional gardens was dealing with poor drainage. I was dealing with water that just flowed right through. The plants took what they needed and the plants are in great condition. Disease issues. If you grow in garden spaces repeatedly, over time, depending on the crop, certain diseases can build up in the soil. And the ones that go through the roots of the tomato plant through the vascular system, such as fusarium wilt, verticillium wilt, nematodes, can get into the soil. These are problems that can be avoided in straw bales and containers because each year you're starting with essentially a sterile straw bale, disease-free. And you can start with containers that, if you have concerns that they have some diseases impregnated in their size, you can bleach them or detergent them out, start with fresh planting mix, and those really tricky heirlooms that have been persnickety in your soil, in your garden, you could have success with them in containers or straw bales. Critter issues. You can, if you have various spots in your yard where the sun shines and some of them have not been gardenable because of the soil condition, but they're more protected from critters. And this is a picture of marauding deer coming through and visiting my tomatoes a few years ago in my driveway. That's a way to remove your garden from the critters by looking at different locations and enjoying the flexibility that containers and straw bales offer when you do so. Now, this is a slide that I use in my tomato talk, and I call it Size Matters. And why do I say that? In tomato speak, if you want to grow the mortgage lifter types, the beefsteak types, the 1.5, 2 pound plus types, you need a lot of sun. We're talking 6 to 8 hours plus, or else you're going to have lots of vine and not that many flowers or tomatoes. For that little tiny Mexico midget at the bottom, if you've got 2 or 3 hours, you can successfully grow a cherry tomato, up to a golf ball sized tomato. So let's say you do want to embark on putting some containers somewhere, putting straw bales somewhere. Look at the sun and then think about the hours of sun that the bales or containers will get in that location, and then right size the type of, or right condition the type of crop that you're going to grow there so that you can maximize success. So one of the things, and I'm going to have to, all of my stuff's this way, so I'm going to move the little bar to the right. Here we go. So this is one of the few wordy slides, and it's a list. And what I wanted to do, though, is to provide a direct comparison between traditional gardening and container gardening, looking at some key parameters. So let's say in your yard you have a beautiful spot that you could dig up for a garden, but the sun doesn't shine there. You can bring your garden to the sun using containers. Where are you going to put your work in creating or maintaining a traditional garden? It's going to be creating that garden, digging it, and then each year it will be weeding and planting. That's where, and of course, watering and things like that. Whereas for container gardening, it may be going to the big box store to get the big bags of the planting mix and then getting them out of the truck and dumping them into a wheelbarrow, filling those containers. Might be a better idea to move the containers where they're going to be and then fill them up so you're not lugging a planting mix filled container. And watering is really the most demanding job for container gardening throughout the summer. As I showed in that previous picture, you can have drainage worries with a traditional garden. Drainage, as long as you have holes in the bottom of your containers, drainage is not an issue. There's less watering and less feeding needed in a traditional garden because you've got that space under the surface of the soil that the roots can go into and find the nutrients in the water that you've added. Whereas with a container, the roots of that plant can only get to whatever is in the bounds of that container. So you have to intervene and make sure that that plant is getting watered to eliminate plant stress as much as possible and feed it regularly to compensate for the nutrients that leach out when you're doing that watering. We talked about you have diseases and critters in the soil. You can start clean with containers and bales. There's certainly a lower cost of goods with gardening because you've got your land, you've dug your garden. It's really the plants or the seeds and then the water and the feeding. There is a higher cost of goods with container gardening at the outset as you collect the containers you want to use, although even the black plastic containers that shrubs and trees come in, they're perfectly fine. You can sometimes find piles of them sitting in median strips, median strips on the highway. You can go to some nurseries and they're always looking to offload some of the containers, and you can take those. It is easier to manage tall plants, vines, trellises, and the like in a traditional soil garden because you can get up on a ladder and you can hammer things into the ground. And we'll talk about some of the more creative staking needed to keep plants that you want to grow vertical. So we're going to talk briefly again about materials. I'm going to get a drink here. We're finding the pollen, the pollen level here is quite high. Material capacities in crops. Anything goes in terms of the materials of your container. Drainage holes are a must, but you have to remember that if you want to use terracotta, water can, I think that should do it. Water can seep through the sides. So if you want, you can wrap the inside of your terracotta with plastic to essentially turn your terracotta pot that you want to use because it's beautiful into a plastic pot, and you'll prevent the water from seeping through the sides. For the appropriate sizes, I've found that 10-gallon minimum is necessary to get acceptable yields from indeterminate, tall-growing tomatoes. 5-gallon is a perfect size for all types of peppers, eggplants, dwarf, or determinate tomatoes, tomatoes that genetically have a characteristic to stay in the 3 or 4 feet tall range, and they don't get a lot of control. Raised beds and elevated planters, to me, are a form of container gardening because you're buying those and you're filling them with planting medium, and then you're treating them throughout the season like containers because you have to make sure you've got enough water and nutrients. What can you grow? As you saw in my first few slides, everything: potatoes, carrots, radishes, greens, flowers, herbs, squash, cucumbers, beets, beans. So, and I remember when I first started gardening way back in the mid-'80s, the thought of being able to translate how you can grow in a big garden to containers seemed foreign to me. And then I read Crockett's Victory Garden, and then I read the Ortho Book of Tomatoes. And then I just started trying stuff, buying containers, putting in planting mix, trying different crops. And with a little bit of tweaking and adjustment, there's really nothing that you can't grow. Your main task is going to be regular feeding and watering. So here we've got 3 different types of containers. We've got fake terracotta on the right. And actually, when we first moved into Raleigh, we had a store called Waccamaw. And my wife would go there to get some home goods and things. And she started finding these big plastic pots that were 10 or 15 gallon at a good price. I'm still using those 28 years later. This white plastic fabric grow bag in the front, that's really great. It's 5 gallon, perfect for dwarf tomatoes. However, I find the added expense is not necessary because you're probably not going to move them around a lot once they're planted. So I now use those black plastic grow bags that you see in the rear right. They come with holes pre-punched. They cost less than $1 each when you buy them in some quantity, and I buy them in boxes of 40, less than $1 each, and some have lasted me for 10 years. Where I buy these are from a company called Peaceful Valley in California, and the website for them is groworganic.com. But it is just an excellent source for gardening supplies, and they've really hit on something with these grow bags. Another type of container is the self-watering container. And I've found something interesting happens when you write a book and a gardening supply company catches wind of you, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's an interesting thing as well. So they think, we're developing some products and we'd like you to test them out, and in return for the product, we'd like you to blog about them. And so I warned them and I said, I'm really not a commercial guy. I don't accept really anything from any company. If I talk about a product, it's because I use it and I love it. And I'm honest. And so send me these and I'll try them out and I'll blog about them. So these came in, the classic tomato planter or something like that, $129.99 each. A pain in the neck to put together. Little plastic pieces were breaking off, but I got them together and I used them and the plants absolutely thrived. How they work is there is a fabric bag that sits over a grating at the bottom, and you can fill the water well up with water through the holes in the sides that you can see. And then there's a wick that runs from that fabric bag of soil into the water. So if you're container gardening and you have to go away for a few days, that water at the bottom that's being wicked up will keep the plant healthy and happy. So my blog was wonderful product, worked great, pain to put together. You need to work in your materials, and it's really, really expensive. But that's just me. That's the kind of thing I say. I will use these for probably a decade or more, however. So all of us with gardening, that are gardening, we have our own personal philosophy to figure out as to what we do or we don't put in the soil, what we do or we don't do in the plants. And that own personal philosophy is going to translate also to the materials we use. And each one of us will make the decision on where we put the money. Is it into the seeds? Is it into the plants? Is it into the pots we use? And there's no wrong or right answer. There's something for everyone. So this is another item they sent me, and it's a raised bed planter that sits about 4 feet off the ground. And I put that together and used it this year. This was a joy to put together. It's not inexpensive, it's beautiful, and I seeded carrots in these in the spring here, and I got 8 lettuce seedlings, 8 spinach seedlings, 2 4-packs from the most wonderful gardening store near the Asheville, Western North Carolina Farmers Market. We've been eating this spinach and we're eating it still. The carrots are just about ready to pick. And I love the fact that I can stand up next to this and work. And right now, since the spinach is almost done, I've tucked Swiss chard into there. And once the carrots come out, I'll probably tuck some bean seeds into there. So I love the flexibility this affords. This is another example of a raised bed that they're asking me to test this year. Again, beautiful, easy to put together, pricey. And what I've found about raised beds, some of you who have done raised bed gardening know this, it really costs a lot of money to put good quality planting material into a raised bed. But there it is. I got one of those big cubes of it's called Soil Cubed, or S3, Supersod makes it. It's a really high quality compost that they come delivered to your house. But a good quantity of 1 cube sits in here with quite a few bags of composting mix. However, this picture was taken maybe in March, and those lettuces a friend had given me actually last September. And I just kept them going in my driveway in Raleigh. When we moved, I potted them up and brought them. All of those greens you see around the edge are kale and collards and chard. My friend Ralph Wisnett actually gave me those plants in September. We grew them outside under floating row cover. They didn't freeze. They're now still here feeding us in June in Hendersonville. We're picking lettuce like crazy. So I love the concept of these. And what I'd like to do now that I've seen this is go to Home Depot and or Lowe's and get some lumber and create a few of them myself. And I'd like to make one just for asparagus and et cetera, make some dedicated raised beds for certain crops. I already touched on this a little bit, is the absolute relevance of the quality of what you're putting in your raised beds or your containers. And it's kind of like a garbage in, garbage out thing. If you go to a big box store and just get those big bags of stuff that's called potting soil or topsoil or garden soil, you'll come home and rip them open and they'll be black and stinky. And when you plant in them and it dries out, they'll crust over and water won't go into it. So my view is if you were to put extra expense into a good quality soilless planting mix, and planting mixes are really just a combination of shredded bark and sterilized loam and peat moss and vermiculite and perlite. And I do a 3-to-1 blend of a soilless mix with a composted manure. And I like to use black cow. It's relatively inexpensive. So let's say 1 big 2 cubic foot bag of planting mix with a 1/2 bag of black cow, put that in my containers. My plants just grow great. You've got the wonderful drainage from the soilless mix and the initial sterility, and you've got the moisture retaining capacity and trace nutrients coming from the black cow to make plants really just pop right out of the ground. Anybody who's read Epic Tomatoes knows that I have a statement in there saying tomatoes are very sensitive to disease. You really shouldn't reuse your bags, your planting mix. So, and I realized that I was putting $300 or $400 or more into those containers in my driveway. And I wanted to do gardeners a favor. So what I started doing, if the plants grew well all year long, and the worst that they got is the lower foliage was getting the typical blotches and spots of early blight and septoria. And those are fungal spores that blow it. They splash up, they blow in. You just remove those blemished leaves, but the plant did fine otherwise. I would just take the plant out at the end of the year, leave the bag out all winter. The soil level now is compressed down because of all the watering and such. Top it up with fresh mix, put your plants in, they do great. So what I'm saying now is the only reason that you would dump your bags at the end of the year is if you have plants that had a real problem, tobacco mosaic virus, fusarium wilt, something that clearly was in the soil and working itself up through the vascular system of the plant. If you reuse that soil, you're just asking for trouble. So a few keys here on successful container gardening is, and this is, I think, most gardening, particularly tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant, is if soil gets wet, if the foliage gets wet, it becomes a magnet for any of the fungal spores that are blowing through the air, which can then attach themselves and cause issues. So I always feed at the base of the plants. And with container gardening, I am actually watering daily because it's starting to get hot, and what you don't want to do is stress the plants. If you let tomatoes in particularly visibly wilt on a hot afternoon, and they've got little tomatoes starting to form, that the stress induced by the wilting of the plant will cause a disruption to the calcium transport system, and the beginnings of blossom end rot will occur. If you use drip irrigation on plants, or you are really disciplined about it and make sure that even in the hottest part of the day, the plants are looking really good, blossom end rot will pretty much completely go away. So watering daily is a bit of a load, but it's kept my plants healthy, and it's rewarded me in high yields and good quality fruit. I also am feeding weekly. And I'm doing that because with all of that watering, you're leaching nutrients out the bottom. But I'm using, and I'm not fancy with what I feed with, I just used a balanced water-soluble plant food, the typical one that you dissolve 1 tablespoon per gallon, and I use about a cup or a cup and a half on each plant, peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, squash, you name it, each week. Keeps the plants healthy and happy, doing really, really well. So this is from a friend setup. If I had the inclination, I would probably set up a drip irrigation system for my container garden, and perhaps even my Bale garden, where you're actually using individual transmitters or emitters on each plant, and you can titrate in the amount of water and the rate that you want that water going in to keep the plant from being stressed. Now we're going to talk about supporting, and then we'll get into just a little travelogue through what I've grown in containers and take some questions. Decks are fantastic for our container gardeners, or container gardens, because you have the railing of the deck that you can lash stakes to. So this is an example of where on the left you can see a tomato plant when it's just getting going. I've got the stake lashed, and on the right, that plant's probably already at 6 feet tall. The one caveat to this is that I found the hard way that labs love tomatoes. And so we had all of our gorgeous tomatoes out there, and we'd come home and we hadn't picked them yet, and some of the dog level tomatoes would be gone with a little puddle of seeds and dogs with their tail between their legs. So don't put temptation in front of your pet. They do like certain types of produce, or at least labs, but then they eat everything, right? So what about if you are in the middle of a patio, or like me, you're in the middle of a driveway, and you are frustrated with the fact that at a certain point of the season, your perfectly organized, lined up vertical garden starts looking like pickup sticks because maybe a thunderstorm comes through, or the plants are getting weighed down with tomatoes, and all you used was one stake in the bag with the fruit, and you've not done anything to fix the ballast there. So as soon as that plant gets heavy, it just tips over. So I thought about, I dealt with this for years, and tomato picking was an exercise in getting on my hands and knees, looking at the tomato, following the vine over to the grow bag or pot and figuring out what plant it came from. But then I thought, I've been container gardening for so long, and sometimes I do just dump them in a pile at the end of the year. And over time, you'll accumulate quite a pile, and it could be soil that you don't want to use anymore, potting mix. You can take that and put it in a pot and not plant anything in that pot, but just use it to affix another stake. And so if you double stake each plant, one stake's in the pot itself with the plant, the grow bag, one is in, I call it the balance pot or the ballast pot, it works really well. And you tie the plant to both, and you tie both of those stakes to each other. Now, it's not perfect, and it doesn't last. If your plants were to get 8 or 9 feet tall and you get an August thunderstorm, you may have some toppling. But here's an example of how probably in mid-July in one of my driveway gardens, I was able to keep everything nice and vertical. And then I thought, as a bonus, that center pot with the 2 stakes is going to be shaded, so you can actually plant things like lettuce and chard and greens in there and just take advantage of the fact you've got a growing area. And you can put something that's not as concerned about heat. It doesn't need the sun, and it really appreciates the shading. So now, before we take a few minutes for container questions, a few things that I've grown successfully. Well, I've grown everything pretty much successfully in 5-gallon, but just to look at the level of that success, this is one jalapeno plant in a 5-gallon container. This is one of my favorite varieties called Piñata, and it's unique in being a pepper that goes from cream to yellow to orange to red, and you have all 4 of those colors on the plant at the same time. This is an eggplant it's one of my own that I actually bred from a hybrid, and this one's called Midnight Lightning. And you know, I mentioned a little bit ago about the improved yields of eggplant and peppers in containers. So in the garden, I was getting maybe 3 or 4 eggplant or bell peppers. In containers, I'm getting 15 or 20 minimum per plant. It's just outrageous. These are the greens that I showed a distant picture of. These were all planted in September or October in Raleigh, moved in January, and now we're still eating these in June. And you've got chard, you've got kale, you've got collard, some bok choy there. Beets are so easy in containers, raised beds, and I do something unusual with beets. I actually will start 15 or 20 seeds in one pot, and then I'll let them germinate. And seeds are not typically monogerm. From one beet seed, you could get 3 plants. But I will separate those out in late winter and put 1 seedling each in a 50-cell plug flat and let them grow up. Then in the spring, I can go into my garden and position those 3 inches apart. That eliminates the need to thin, and you don't really get any weeds, or they're easy to find, and you end up with a crop of perfectly uniform, smooth beets in your containers. That was taken yesterday. So the lettuce and the beets have grown up, and I've actually, that bean back there has a little story I'll tell you in a moment, but I've got some beans in there as well. Be creative with your containers. And when we moved in here, we have a bird bath that no longer holds water. So we filled it with dirt, and we put in a couple of a dark red wave petunia that my friend Ralph gave me. This had pansies in it in the early spring, and now we transitioned that over to petunias. And as the coup de grace, I even managed to grow a Moon and Stars, a Moon and Stars watermelon in a 15-gallon container. This is a really historically important melon. They can get up to 20 pounds. You can often find them at the farmer's market. And they look like a black cannonball with yellow splotches all over the fruit and the vines. And I didn't grow a 20-pounder, but it did get up to 8 pounds growing out of a container. And the reason I had them on newspapers so that they wouldn't burn in the concrete. And so I am going to, Charlotte, take a pause for some container gardening questions for a few minutes. This is actually me yesterday in the Pisgah National Forest surrounded by mountain laurel. So we really like hiking around here. For anybody who's in Henderson or Buncombe, this place is heaven. So that's the container gardening part. And let's take a few.
All right. We do have some questions in the chat, so I'll ask people to continue entering those questions in the chat, but we'll start off. And the first question says blue water. He mentioned blue water cup a week, but do you recommend Epsom salt?
So what's great about the Epsom salts question is I've still never gotten the definitive, I've not yet done the definitive controlled study to tell me exactly what it does. And every time I give a talk on tomatoes, I pose this challenge to the audience. Take two of the same variety of tomato, say Cherokee Purple, Sun Gold, whatever, and grow them either in your garden or in the container or in a straw bale, and separate them. And with one of those plants, do your typical regimen. With the other, add Epsom salts to it. Because what I would like to see is the actual effect. Is it an effect on foliage color? Is it an effect on yield? Is it an effect on flavor or plant health? You know, it's magnesium, and a lot of planting mixes and a lot of our soil has sufficient trace elements of magnesium. So to me, it is personally still an unanswered question. I have a science background, and being a gardener is interesting because gardening is so much what your grandparents told you or your great-grandparents, and what your friends share in folklore and some urban legends, and then control studies and science. So sometimes living in this gardening space, to me, to answer some of these questions will just cause me to go out and do an experiment. And that reminds me, maybe I'll do that experiment this year. It can't hurt. What I don't know quantifiably is exactly what it will help, unless you do have a magnesium micronutrient deficit in your mix.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not 100% sure how often it's needed, but I will add, especially when I was at the coast, a lot of people had hard water, so high calcium, and it would drive the pH up. And I sometimes wondered if, and they would say, oh, my plants look so much better with Epsom salt, and I often wondered if it was the sulfur, you know, the magnesium sulfate, that was just reducing the pH a little bit, and that's what they were seeing.
Well, and what's great about this, what's great about this question, Charlotte, is that we've been gardening for as long as we've been walking the earth, and the vast majority of questions have some answers associated with it, but really not. There hasn't been too much hard research on some of these questions, or at least it's not easy to find collected in one place. That's one of the great things about gardening as a hobby, is every time you go out there and plant something or dig something, any one of us can discover something and then share it.
Absolutely. Okay, so our next question says, how can I be sure my straw bales do not have any pesticide residue?
We will get that into the next section. We'll talk about that as a central theme. So thanks for the question. I could not have been set up any better for the next half of this talk.
All right. So next question says, is there any benefit to placing pine cones in the bottom of a container and then putting your soil mix on top of that, especially if you want the container to be lighter?
I wouldn't, depending, I mean, certainly pine cones will take a while to break down, but when pine breaks down, it can acidify slightly. It's sort of like, to me, the eggshell question, where I put eggshells in my compost, and you look at that compost a few years later and the eggshells are still there. So a lot of times these things take a long time to break down chemically, and so there's not a whole lot of significance they have. The other thing about making, yes, you can make the containers lighter, but what you don't want to do is rob the roots of surface area of planting mix that they have to work around in. And maybe I'll say at this point, when I talk a 5-gallon container, I'm actually looking at the type of plants that I want to grow, and I'm deciding, do I want my yield to be maximized? So I'll fill that within 2 inches at the top. In other cases, these are research and development plants. It's a cherry tomato that volunteered in my garden, so I really just need a few trusses of fruit to see what it's going to do. So I may put 1 or 2 gallons. I may leave that much space in the grow bag. The reason I'm saying that is I'm thinking you're putting these pine cones in the bottom, and they could take up space that the soil would use and then the roots would go into. So I'd say it's not really about lightness and about weight. It's about thinking about the type of plant you're growing, why you're growing it, and making sure that it has an appropriate amount of planting mix in your grow bag or container to be able to get the type of yield that you expect. Not everybody is a yield gardener. So if I'm going to have 100 tomatoes, 20 peppers, 10 eggplant, and each one of those has a reason that I'm growing them. My 24 indeterminates are the ones that I want to eat. So I want to can, I want to gouge on them. So I'm going for maximum yield on those. But my other 60 or 70 tomatoes are me just playing in the garden. And I may toss the plant after I pick a few fruit if I don't like the flavor. Or I may decide this is delicious and top the bag up with 2 more gallons of soil and then maximize the yield out of it. So where you start with doesn't necessarily have to be where you end up. I'm very much in kind of the flexible, adjust as you go type of gardening.
All right, we do have actually several more questions. So the next one says, to prune or not to prune tomato plants?
Let's talk about pruning in the straw bale section because at the very end I'm going to show, I added a slide about our dwarf tomato breeding project just because they're perfect for containers and straw bales, and we'll get into pruning a little bit then. But I think, Charlotte, we need my tomato talk at some point, and then we can dive deep into all of that. I'll also talk about my Instagram live that I'm doing on Friday, because one of the things I will be doing live on Fridays at 3 o'clock every week this year is doing things in my garden that are appropriate. So at some point, I'm going to be pruning my plants, and I can show what that looks like. I'll be topping plants. At some point, I'm going to actually do a cross. And so people can come in on Instagram and watch that happening and ask me questions live.
Excellent. So there are a few questions here about how to prepare the straw bale. So you're going to be going through that in the next set of slides.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll hold off on those.
And I don't have a clock, Charlotte, so you can let me know what time we're at right now.
Okay, it's 9:43.
Okay, why don't we jump into the next section?
Okay, and then we can come back.
Then we'll do questions until good. Well, great. Thank you, folks. Absolutely great questions, but then I expect nothing less from gardeners, from Master Gardener volunteers, from North Carolina Master Gardener volunteers. Being a gardener here is just beyond belief in terms of enjoyment. Straw bale gardening. Why am I in this in the first place? Well, after I wrote Epic Tomatoes, Story Publishing realized they didn't have a straw bale book in their portfolio, and it was becoming a thing. And so they asked me if I'd be interested in writing it. And I said, well, of course I'd be interested in writing it, but first I have to explore it and try it. So I took a few years, because previously when I looked at a straw bale, I thought, housing material, Halloween decorations, the church straw bale ride where you sit on it in the back of a truck. But I didn't think about gardening. Maybe I thought about it as a mulch. So where does this practice come from? The other thing that writing the book did is it sent me to do some research, because there is a straw bale garden book out there. And if you read it, it's a good book, but it makes it sound like the person invented it and that it is perfect and has no flaws whatsoever. So what I wanted my book to do is to be a real guide for gardeners, warts and all. Where did this come from, and where does it work, and where does it have issues, or at least where do you have to be more careful? So the reports of this being used commercially for the first time was actually pickle companies growing cucumbers in straw bales way back in the 50s. The principle, and I'm sure a lot of you know about Ruth Stout and her lasagna gardening method, and it really is in a way the same type of a principle, but it actually was first reported by a horde agent at the University of Florida, Dr. Gary Wade, in the late 70s. And then there was a Mother Earth News article in 1982 written by Don Knight. So Joel Karsten wrote his book in the early 2000 teens. So this had been around for a good 60 years before Joel decided to really jump on the bandwagon and write the book, and it became more widely known and more popularized. I expect that there were people who grew up on farms or had big gardens that had straw bales and noticed what happened when they started breaking down, and they had the idea, hey, we could plant something in that. So that's where it comes from. I'm not going to go through this line by line because it's a very similar slide to the one I used when comparing dirt gardening on the left to container gardening, except this time the right column is about straw bales. The only ones that are significantly different, the sweat equity in straw bale gardening is actually lugging the bales. And it's not that they're that heavy, but they're uncomfortable because they're scratchy, and those little straws can get inside your shirt and make you itchy. And you have to pick them up by the strings and hold them tight, because the difference between a straw bale and a pile of mulch is nothing more than the string slipping off. And it's like a high tension slinky. It will just pop. But they're not that heavy before you treat them. Once you start treating them, they start absorbing all of that moisture like a sponge. You wouldn't want to move them at that point. So you want to make sure they're where you're going to use them. Now, I have in red Bale source. So this is something that never used to even be talked about. I read the books that were out there about this. It was never mentioned. It's straw. You bale it up, it dries. And there's two things. A lot of people mix up straw bale and hay bale. Hay is a grass. The big rolls that you see in the fields, hay would break down very, very quickly and probably not provide you with the structural integrity you need to be able to grow a crop all season long, particularly in a hot area. But when I think of straws, think of little hollow drinking straws. And if you examine a wheat straw bale closely, that's what you have. It's packed all of these little drinking straws parallel to each other. But persistent herbicides. So how did I find this out? Well, I was getting my bales from big box stores. The first year, I think I tried 15. They all grew great. The second year, I think I got 20. And 2 of my bales were killing my plants. And how do I know this? How do I know it just wasn't a diseased plant? Well, I had a sun-gold. Sun-gold is a hybrid. It's like a weed. It grows like crazy. So I grew it in the straw bale, and I noticed right from the start, I'd water it, and it got to be a foot tall. As the roots got into the bale, sun-gold was wilting. And then I'd water it, and it would perk up a little bit, and then it would wilt. So I actually snipped a sucker off that sun-gold, and I put it in a glass of water, and it perked right up. And I rooted it, and then I planted it in a container, and it thrived and grew normally all year long. I noticed that the bale did not have very much wheatgrass coming out of it. So clearly, 2 of my bales, the other bale, the plants did not thrive as well. Must have been impregnated with persistent herbicides. It's a hard one because I don't know yet the incidence of herbicide spraying on wheat fields, but I would suspect it's quite prevalent. But to do straw bale gardening, there's 2 things I would do. I would actually test a source the first year on a small scale. This year, I actually kind of went all in on ag supply over in Mills River near me. And what have I got out there? 20 bales. I'm 20 for 20. They are absolutely thriving. I did talk to the fellow. He thought that they were organically grown and that there were no herbicides used. But it's a discussion worth having, because if you go through all the work of preparing a straw bale and you're putting in your plants and it's killing your plants, that's really, really depressing. So I think container gardening is open to gardeners everywhere because you can find containers everywhere. Straw bale gardening is a bit more specialized. And remember, I wanted to bring out some of the distinctions because bale costs vary, and where they're harder to get, they're going to be much more expensive. I'm paying about $6 a bale. That's what I paid in Raleigh. When I lived in Raleigh, I ended up getting my bales from Campbell Road Nursery and Norwood Road Nursery, which is in North Raleigh, and they were both fantastic. Both of them, I didn't see any incidents. So the only place I ran into problems with herbicide laced bales were the big box stores. Moderate cost of goods, creative staking. But it also comes to availability of the bales. And I'm sure that there are people in areas of the country where it's just not easy to get at them. So keep all of these things in mind. So how do we make this happen? Well, you need to turn this block of straws that are essentially nothing but cellulose into it's almost like you're making a molten lava cake where the lava is going to be loam that is being created as micronutrients are chewing up the cellulose. And to trigger and to catalyze that process, you're adding heavy doses of nitrogen. And and anybody, so I've got my book on this, but I also wrote a blog entry for Gardener Supply, and people can email me and I can send them the link, or you can Google Craig LeHoullier Garden Supply strawbale, and that will be the first thing that will pop up because I talk about this prep process. So when I say heavy doses of nitrogen, I'm talking half a cup of a 2805 lawn starter type fertilizer. Make sure it's not a weed and feed. Make sure you don't have any type of an herbicide in there. So it's just nitrogen onto that bale, and then I'm watering heavily. So I'm actually got the hose out and I'm counting to 30. The water is reaching all through the bale, and it's dissolving amounts of that nitrogen and drawing them into the bale. Not all of it, and you will still see it, of course. So the second day, that's day 1. Day 2, you water. Day 3, nitrogen and water. Day 4, water. Day 5, nitrogen and water. Day 6, water. Then you're doing half dose nitrogen, quarter cup per bale with heavy watering after. And then it's a cup of 10-10-10. Or if you want to go organic, if you want to go organic in the nitrogen phase, you've got things like fish emulsion, you've got things like blood meal, but each one of these has some caveat that makes it a little bit more challenging to use than the 2805. And I've been getting emails from people talking about the aroma that using the blood meal causes. And in the book, I was trying to extrapolate up the 2805 to the nitrogen content of blood meal, and it ends up to be quite a quantity. I would like to adjust that down and say use like a half a cup of blood meal per application, because I think it's just the case of getting some nitrogen into the bale to start the process. And I think that can be reduced. But then you're using a 10-10-10, or if you want to go organic, you can use an espoma, like a plant tone or a tomato tone, and you deeply water. I used to measure the temperature of the bales during this process, and depending on the ambient weather, the ambient temperature, they can often reach 135 degrees or so. So you are creating this internal compost pile. But that's variable, and some people are doing bale prep, and I've done some bale prep, and the temperature's only gotten up to 80 or 90. It doesn't matter. What I find is if I start the prep on day 1, I wait 2 weeks. So I'm starting it on a Sunday, and in 2 weeks on a Sunday, I can plant that bale, and it's worked. That's my method now. So here are all of your different options, not all of your different options, they're infinite, but you've got blood meal, you've got fish fertilizer for your high nitrogen, you've got plant tone for your balanced, and you've got your 10-10-10 if you want to go with that, and you've got your 2805. So this is what the bales look like as they're getting going, and you can see the white and grayish granules of the 2805 sitting on top there. That's already been watered. You can see there's still going to be residue there. This is an example of them sitting in my driveway with the treatment begun. And what's interesting is you can see the patterns of the driveway of planting pots past, the ghosts of previous gardens, as you get the moss to grow between where they were. This is a good time to mention that there is no difference between string side up and string side down in the terms of bale performance. What you should do is think about orientation, think about how level your ground is. They seem to be a little more stable if they're string side up because you've got more surface area on the ground. You can see at the very back of this slide, I actually, for my indeterminate tomatoes, I had them string on the side and a little bit taller, but behind those bales were my 8-foot stakes to prevent those bales from toppling over. This is the bale layout that I'm using in my yard this year. So I've got a dozen bales string side outward for my indeterminate tomatoes, 2 tomatoes per bale, and I've got the groupings of 4 bales string side up for the squash and the beans. One of the things that can be really helpful if you have a lot of bales, and be creative with how you arrange your bale garden. You know, make ladders out of them. There's a fellow in Wake Forest named Kent Rogers who really shared a lot of his, he was known as the straw, or he is known as the straw bale man in Wake Forest. He does great things with straw bales. But watering, particularly for direct seeded crops, that top surface, we're going to talk about how to prepare bales for direct seeding in. If you were to lay down a soaker hose before you put a layer of potting mix on there, it will help to keep more moisture at the surface as those seeds are germinating. This is what it looks like when I was preparing bales for direct seeded squash in my garden some years ago. It's just about a 3-inch layer of a good quality planting mix, whatever you'd put in your containers. You put your seeds right in the top. This is what a tomato seedling looks like when it's planted in the bale. You use no additional potting mix except for a little bit to fill in the crevice that forms when you plant the plant. So after a 2-week prep, the bales have gotten much softer. You just reach your hands in and you can create a crevice. And you pop your seedling out of a cup, the planting pot, and you work it in as deep as you can. Just like in containers in a regular garden with tomatoes, it's good to get as much of the stem covered as you can because it will root all along the stem that's under the soil. So I probably use no more than a cup of planting mix just to fill in the space that happens after you make the crevice and put the plant in. And they grow very, very rapidly. So do these. And so straw bale gardening would be a really fun thing to do to get kids interested in gardening because of all the visual changes that they go through so quickly. You get your bales prepared, and after that 2 weeks goes by, one day you're going to go up early in the morning and you're going to have all of these mushrooms popping out. And then the sun comes up and the mushrooms essentially melt. And the next day, more come out. The mushrooming process does end eventually. The only thing that it can interfere in is if you're direct seeding into bales and it hasn't gone through the mushroom phase yet, you've got all your seeds in there and those mushrooms can pop up and push the seed out of the soil. So my suggestion would be, if you want to use direct seeds into a straw bale, let the mushrooming come and go. So you may want to start it a few weeks earlier for direct seeding. The other thing that happens is wheatgrass. And there are other, if you could find oat bales, alfalfa bales, barley bales, there's other types. I would avoid pine, of course. It's not very water absorbent and can become quite acidic. But then you can see the wheatgrass. I don't trim them. I don't mind if my bales need a haircut. I've actually found we have rabbits in our yard here, and instead of going after my plants, they're going after the nice tender grass that's at the bottom of the bales. You can snip it if you want and use it as mulch on the top of the bales, but the plants grow fast. So we're going to take a look at what grows in bales pictorial in a minute, but this is recommended numbers and density of planting and types of plants in the bale. So on the left are slips or bulbs or seedlings, 2 tomato seedlings, 2 eggplant seedlings, 2 pepper seedlings. And I'm actually doing the 2 tomato, pepper, eggplant, but I'm planting a basil plant in the center of the bale. Well, I mean, basil and tomatoes go together, but it's a good way to use that space. And yeah, the tomato plants will get tall, but that basil will eventually find its way out and maybe hang over the side, but you'll be able to use that space. 2 tomatoes, 2 eggplant, 2 peppers. Is any amount of herbs or leeks, potatoes, greens, beets, garlic, sweet potatoes, spacing on these is what you would reasonably use in a typical garden. For potatoes, they say maybe 4 or 5 eye potatoes. Now on the right are direct seeded crops, starting from the smallest at the top to the largest. And the issue with the small seeded crops in straw bales that you'll plant into that upper layer of soil that you put down is they have very shallow root systems when they first germinate. So you'd either want to cover them with a covering or newspaper early on so that they don't germinate and then the sun comes out and you're not there to water that top layer and the plants will wither and die. Or that's, if you want to plant radishes and carrots, maybe that's the one to snake your soaker hose through so that it's keeping moist. But cucumbers, melons, squash, beans, and anything large seeds, annual flowers, just direct seed right in. And I'm going to say things grow very fast. So let's take a look. This picture was taken yesterday, and you can see that the bales are already starting to lose their integrity a little bit, but that's fine. The roots are all within there. These plants were have probably been in for about, I don't know, 30 days or so, and they're already a foot tall. So the heat generated as the center of that bale is forming loam really does push the plants to grow quickly. I don't know if you can see it here, but there's 2 stakes on each plant. I've got the 8-foot stake that's on the sides of the bale, which the plant will primarily be tied to. But I've also got a guide stake that I insert diagonally at the base of the plant and then tie it to the bale about 3 feet off the ground. I tie the plant to that guide plant until it reaches the big stake. And the reason I do that is because as a tomato plant grows and it gets weight on the top in the fruit form, it can start slipping down because the top of the plant is getting heavy. And I have had plants snap off at the base within about 6 inches from where they emerge out of the ground because they have to make that road. It's 6 inches to 12 inches to get from the base of the plant to that tall stake. So by giving them this guide, I'm preventing that snapping off effect. So these are bush beans coming up, and that was when I planted them, I think 30 days ago. And this is what they look like yesterday. So I was really shocked for the last 2 years gardening in Raleigh that I was getting squash and beans 40 days from planting the seeds, which is about 10 or 15 days in advance of what the packet said. So again, testament to the heat of the bale. The sun is beating on the top of the bale. You've got heat everywhere. It's just a case of keeping things watered and fed. And for those who love bush green beans and hate picking them because you're in the garden and you're bending over, bales are wonderful because I literally pulled up a chair to pick the beans. And it is a back saver to bring the produce up to the level where you can deal with it more comfortably. This is an example of growing cucumbers in a straw bale, that tall plant in the center. And how I did that, if you look right in the middle of this slide, you can see that I have a tomato cage. One of the cone-shaped, I like to call them useless tomato cages because they are useless for indeterminate, for tall growing tomatoes, but they're fantastic. You can pop that, plant your cucumber seeds, and then once they germinate, just slip that cone-shaped cage over that hill of cukes. They'll climb in the inside and outside of that cage, and all of your cucumbers will hang down and you can see them. Works really great. This is squash, and there's that cucumber plant just popping up in the middle. It's a diva, it's my favorite, and I've got summer squash around the border. And that was about 30 days ago. And I've got buds, and I'm probably going to see flowering on these squash plants today. So it's all happening fast. And there's that tomato cage in the middle that will hold the cucumber vines. Here's a picture of last year's zephyrs forming on the squash plants in the bale. Eggplant, like the same case of growing eggplant and peppers in containers happens with straw bales, is that the plant's vigor is beyond belief and the yield is great. And I guess I should mention tomatoes here. So last year I grew my favorite indeterminate tomatoes in straw bales, 2 plants per bale, and we're talking Cherokee Purple, Chocolate Green, Brandywine. I averaged 20 to 25 pounds of fruit each plant in straw bales in my driveway. And that's not even with optimum sun. So 50 pounds of tomatoes per straw bale. I was really pleased with that. It's not what you would get if you were to cage, of course, in really rich ground, but it's not bad. An example of 2 bell pepper plants just fruiting away in a straw bale. This is showing where I plant basil, and this is between 2 dwarf growing tomatoes. So the tomatoes are never going to get more than a few feet tall, and there's that basil in the middle. And this is anecdotal, but a few years ago I noticed, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, where downy mildew is becoming a real problem with basil here. And I had a row of it in my garden, and I lost essentially, not overnight, but very quickly I lost all of those. And for me, basil had been like growing weeds. I never had a problem with it. I tried the basil that I've been growing in my straw bales has either been marginally very late or not affected at all by the downy mildew. Again, could be anecdotal, it could just be the season, but I'm very encouraged by that. Swiss chard, rainbow on the left, red Russian kale on the right. That's a Chioggia beet. Chioggia is one of those that have the red and white alternating rings. And what I would do is every 2 inches or so, I would just slip a beet seedling in, and it just worked great. So before I agreed to write the book, this is the big experiment here. I told Story that I don't want to write a book on anything unless I've convinced myself that straw bales can be made to work to equal container and standard gardening. So I took my 2 favorite tomatoes, Sun Gold cherry tomato and Cherokee purple slicing tomato. And in my garden, this is maybe in 2014 when I still had sufficient sunlight in the front. I planted a Sun Gold in a bale, the ground, the container, Cherokee purple in a bale, the ground, in a container. And the plants performed equally, they yielded equally, the health of the plants were equal, and the flavor of the fruit were equal. And then I said, okay, I'm now ready to write this book because I figured out what works well, what the challenges are. But that was then, and I've now been doing it 3 or 4 more years. So each year I'm learning more and more about this. For example, the risk of persistent herbicides in the bale, that's something that popped out in the last few years. So I just want to really briefly mention the dwarf tomato project because I do have some plants here, and because, whoops, sorry, I shouldn't have done that. There we go. I have some plants here, and they're perfect for containers and bales. So this project started with an idea in 2005 when my customers for my seedlings kept asking, I love the indeterminate heirlooms that you grow, but what have you got that I can grow in a pot and I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it? So we my friend Patrina in Australia and I put a project together. And here we are in 2020, sorry, got a leg cramp because of our hiking yesterday, so I'm just gonna sit here and grit my teeth. So it's been winding down since 2018, but in those 15 years, we have employed the talents of 700 volunteers all over the world, every state, 25 countries, and in the Victory Seed Company catalog, we have put 123 new varieties. So every color and size that you can imagine with heirlooms, we are now replicating. And dwarfs mean a plant that tops out at around 4 feet tall. The way I like to look at it is it grows at half of the vertical rate of an indeterminate variety. So if in your garden, your Cherokee purple reaches 8 feet tall, the corresponding dwarf will be 4 feet tall. So pretty exciting. I actually have a talk just about this project that I'm going to be sharing with some gardeners in Canada in a few weeks. And my 3rd book will be telling the story about this project, how we did it, what the highlights were, get into a little bit about basic plant genetics and basic plant breeding. So the reason that I'm here, aside from being invited by wonderful people on your end, is that I had a grandfather, Walter, on the left, and my dad, Wilfred, on the right, who, when I was very, very young, instilled the love of gardening in me. So my goal is to help you all grow some great gardeners and share this great passion. These are my books. They're available kind of everywhere, although if you want signed copies, you can contact me. This is how to reach me. And so you can get my website. I blog. I have a frequently asked questions, a list of my speaking events. You can email me anytime. At NC Tomatogram on Instagram. And like I said, every Friday at 3 o'clock, I go live from my yard for 45 minutes and take questions. You can sign up for my newsletter on the website. And if you're nearby, I will have seedlings for a few more weeks. And I think I've got something like 80 varieties of tomatoes split evenly between indeterminate and dwarf. I hope that I shared something exciting and new and interesting with all of you. And I'm totally confident that each one of you on the other end of this could share something new and equally exciting to me. So let's keep in touch. let's be a North Carolina gardening group that's going to help save the world, and get out there and get your hands dirty and grow something great. Thank you all so much for your attention. Thank you, Charlotte.
All right. Thank you, Craig. So you'll be able to take some more questions?
Yep.
Okay. So that was fantastic. And we'll send out all this contact information as well later with a follow-up email.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let's see where we were. And I've asked Caroline to help me too. So Caroline, if you find maybe where we left off with the questions.
Sure.
And can help me, yeah, read out. I think maybe the fusarium one.
Yeah,
Is there a cure for
too.
fusarium wilt? Okay. Is there a cure for fusarium wilt in containers, or do you just sterilize and start over?
So fusarium wilt is a really frustrating tomato disease that has been with us. If you look at seed catalogs, even in the mid-1800s, people dealt with it. It's a fungus. It has different races now. It works into the vascular system of the plant and essentially shuts off the water supply. Interestingly, I learned the hard way that fusarium wilt can be seed-borne. In other words, if you save fruit off a tomato that's on a fusarium-grown plant, spores can work themselves up into the seed coat, and then you can grow seeds from that, and it can reinfect the following year. If you have it in the garden, really the only thing to do is to find a grafted tomato where the graft is either tolerant or resistant to the particular race of fusarium that you have in your garden. Rotate away from that spot for a few years. In a container, fusarium, the only way that fusarium should be able to get into a container is if you have soil that you're using some garden soil or compost that somehow infected plant material from a fusarium infected plant has gotten in, or you've got it on a piece of ground where when the roots, let's say you have containers that you want to use on top of soil in your garden, and if the roots get into there, they could contact it that way. From everything I've heard, fusarium should not be insect transmitted, but I have my doubts because I've grown some plants in the past that have come down with it, but I haven't sorted totally out the vector. So I think either using grafted tomatoes where the rootstock is specifically bred to resist or tolerate fusarium, or go with a variety that has as many F's after the name as you can. But understanding that even tolerance and resistance is not permanent throughout the season. And tolerance is when the fusarium goes into the roots, but the plant somehow tolerates it for a while. Resistance is if the roots essentially resist the movement of the fusarium into the roots. But in high concentration areas, what those F's after the name will buy you is a few more weeks of help, but eventually a high population of fusarium fungus will defeat that plant as well. So really it's, like you said, get good seed, get good seedlings, and start in a clean pot with good sterile planting mix, rotate it away in your garden. If you need to put a container in your garden, create a physical barrier, a piece of fabric cloth or something so the roots won't come out the bottom of your straw bale or pot and get into that infected gardening soil. But I find around here it's really early blight and septoria create most of the problems that we have. But it's really important to get also good, accurate diagnosis of your diseases because tomatoes just have a host of bacterial, viral, and fungal diseases. And sometimes telling one from another can be really, really challenging. So a long answer to an excellent question.
A real simple question, Craig, for you is to please repeat the favorite cucumber variety that you mentioned.
Diva, D-I-V-A. So Johnny selected seed, it's not a hybrid either. And it was bred by Johnny Selected Seeds up in Maine and won an All-American award. And they're not really long. They may be, you want to pick them at about 6 inches long, but they're one of the bitterless, smooth skin varieties. They have hardly any seeds, and they're just sweet, not a trace of bitterness to them. So once, and my wife has pickled them successfully. I think once you try Diva, anybody would probably not grow another cucumber. Now, the one issue is they are susceptible a little bit more to things like cucumber mosaic and mildew. So because it's not a hybrid, it's open pollinated, it hasn't been loaded up with lots of disease resistances. So I would say try it for the first few years, see how it does, and maybe over time you'd have to switch if your diseases build up.
Thank you. Excellent.
Yeah.
There's a couple different questions about how you handle the spent bales and the composted plant material at the end of the season.
Sure. So what happens with bales is you start out with this nice firm block, and a straw bale actually at the beginning is the equivalent of two 20-gallon containers, which is why you get such incredible performance. You're really giving your roots a lot of room to work with. If you grow what I call really aggressive types of plants like tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, where you've got really big root systems and they really suck a lot of nutrients out, your bale will be collapsed into maybe a 1 foot tall, loosely aggregated pile with a little bit of wheat straw and a lot of this nice black rich loam. So what I tend to do, and the two strings will still be in there. Now, if they're positioned right, sometimes you can take those two strings, lift up the residue, carefully put them in your wheelbarrow, remove the strings, and you've got the most gorgeous either mulch or material to put in your planting pots. It's great stuff. It's really nice, rich loam. As far as the plants themselves, with tomatoes, of course, I don't like to compost the green parts because invariably you were going to have septoria leaf spot and early blight fungus on your plants by the end of the season. So I'd have a special place for those where they don't get composted in with the rest of your soil. Eggplants and peppers tend not to be as bad. So I would say always watch your plant material. So, you know, if your zucchini plants and things like that are covered with mildew, you don't really want to compost those in. So maybe, yeah, have a place in your yard or your garden where you put plant material where, you know, it either gets tossed or it's somewhere where it's not going to be used. But also know that spores can travel. One of the ways that we pick up late blight, people have been dumping infected potatoes in piles. They actually grow, and then the late blight spores form on the plant, and then you get a day where it's a little breezy and those spores take off, and then they land on your plants, and that's how you infect. So it's be aware of where your plant material is if it has issues. But yeah, your spent bales. The flip side of that is if you grow low intrusive things in your bales like lettuce, and the integrity of your bale is kind of still there, put a second crop in, a fall crop of lettuce or greens or something like that. Put in garlic in the fall and let them sit out there all winter. They'll germinate and the bales will be collapsed a little bit by spring, but you'll be able to go in there and harvest garlic. The other thing I've done in the garden is let those collapsed bales build like a 6-inch layer in the front that's just straw and the loam from the collapsed bales, and put garlic or onions into that and let them grow over the winter. So very useful stuff, actually.
Excellent. Yes. Thank you. Another question was about when we were talking about the terracotta pots and lining them with plastic. Have you had any experience with the homemade hypertufa pots, and should you handle that the same way?
I haven't. What are they?
Okay.
What are they? Are they porous as well, like a terracotta, or?
Yeah, in my knowledge, they are porous because they're basically cement,
Okay.
cement and sand mixture. However, some people have glazed their pots that are hypertufa. So depending on glazing or not would be where I'd go with that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with creating a barrier on the inside to prevent that water from getting through. I mean, you could just take a strip of a black plastic bag. The other thing I've not done yet, and I think it's worth investigating, is when you think of a straw bale, it's exposed, right? You've got the sun beating on it from all sides. What if you were to wrap the exterior of the bale in just a strip of clear or black plastic to cut down on the amount of surface area that's being exposed to the sun that liquids can respire out of? So again, there's some people actually build wooden frames to slip the straw bales into, which is, so you grow in there, and then at the end of the year, you don't have to remove anything. You now can use that planter for something else because all you've got in there is a nice layer of mulch. So I would say gardeners are great at thinking out of the box. So for use of pots and use of bales and wrapping and water retention, I'm sure lots of people on this call will come up with many, many ideas that have not even hit into my brain that will be great to share.
Terrific. How much soilless or soil media per bale would you say you're using?
Oh gosh, if I'm planting seedlings, I'm maybe using 2 cups or 3 cups of planting mix per bale to settle those plants into. If I'm overspreading a 3-inch layer to put seeds in, each bale will probably take 1 gallon capacity pot of planting mix, or maybe a little bit more. So it is really minimal.
Okay.
So another way to put it is, if I look at all my 20 bales, and 8 of them are direct seeded, 12 of them are plants, all of the planting medium to cover preparation of those is probably no more than 1 2 cubic foot bag of a soilless mix in 1 25-pound bag of a black cow. So very, very minimal cost. So your cost with bales is primarily the bale, and your costs with container gardening is the containers and when you put in the containers. So I could say that I put $300 or $400 in my driveway, but if you pick 2,000 pounds of produce and you're eating great vegetables at 50 cents a pound, and you're getting an incredible amount of exercise every day all summer long and hearing the birds out there, and one of the things I like to plant with gardeners as a thought is, to truly love gardening, I think you need to fall in love with the process of gardening and not ever be focused really on the destination, because the deer could eat your favorite plant, disease could kill this or that. But if you've loved everything that's happened up to that point, it's great. You've had a great garden, even if you haven't filled your 50-quart jars with tomatoes, because there's no guarantees with gardening, and every year is a different adventure.
That's for sure. I think you're in good company there. People are smiling at that comment. One question was about your squash. Do you thin your squash to 1 per hill or per spot, or do you leave multiple seedlings?
I've just let them go, and with that weekly feeding, it seems they seem to be happy. Now, one thing I will mention, and I need to think about how to do this better. If you plant, let's say you have bales that you direct seed, and you have bean plants or squash plants, and you've taken those hills and they're pretty close to the edge. Those of us who have grown summer squash or beans know that even though it's a bush type of squash, it will kind of vine out. And beans, even though it says it's a bush type of bean, they'll bend over. So sometimes you will see, if you plant too close to the edge, the weight of the produce on those plants will start pulling the roots out of the ground a little bit. So I'm starting to think that it would actually be good. That's why I planted them much more toward the center. So some of the bale will support that overspread. But there's a way to use more bales to create maybe a step ladder type of an approach. So if the plant were to come over, it would actually have something to lean on, and it might be another bale. Now, you may be spending an extra $5 here and there just to use bales as kind of architectural support, or maybe you could just get a cardboard box and have it come over and sit on that. But we have to think of the aesthetics of the garden at some point. And my garden with the bales and the grow bags, I think my wife is going to have something to say about how crazy that looks. But then when I tell her about all the wonderful things we make with our tomatoes all summer long, we get forgiveness. So
yeah. I don't know if you want to go back and address this or not, but the pruning or not pruning your tomatoes, please.
Let's talk about that. So we'll spend a few minutes on that. And that is something that creates incredible amounts of widespread angst and confusion amongst all tomato growers everywhere. So let's demystify it just a little bit. First of all, if you think of the type of tomato you're growing. The main 3 categories genetically of growth habit are dwarf, which really are pretty obscure still, determinate, and anybody who's grown Roma or Taxi or Sophie's Choice knows what a determinate is. It grows about 3 feet tall, it puts out a ton of tomatoes, and then it kind of poops out. An indeterminate, of which 95% of tomatoes are. So now we're talking Big Beef, Lemon Boy, Cherokee Purple, Sun Gold, German Johnson. The first 2 types, dwarf and determinate, should not be pruned at all. especially blossom cluster pruning. Now, you can do some foliage pruning if your plants are too dense or too thick or they're touching. Tomato plants make lots of foliage, but if your plants are too dense, that's where you get the spores from early blight or septoria can work in there where the sun doesn't shine. You start getting the lesions and things, and those lesioned leaves should be picked off. Pruning really applies to indeterminate. So right now out there, I know that I've got a brandywine that has 9 leads on it. So you've got your main stem, you've got your leaves coming off at about 90 degrees, and at a 45-degree angle at every juncture comes a sucker. If you cage your tomatoes, concrete reinforcing wire, 6 feet tall, 3 feet wide, don't prune a thing. The yields will be enormous because so you have a central stem, it's going to have so many flowers on it. Let one sucker go, that will have just as many flowers on it, and you'll double your potential yield. Let a third sucker go, you'll triple your potential yield. So every sucker removal reduces the potential yield of the tomato plant. Leaving all the suckers does not remove fruit. It does not lower fruit quality, does not lessen fruit size, does not change the flavor. As long as you give it the feeding and watering that's needed to support a plant that's going to be that much wider. What I like to do, and it's also related to how you support your tomatoes. So if you're a staker like I am, I will pick a certain number of suckers that I let develop, and I probably let 3 suckers go. So add the center stem in. That means I will have 4 fruiting stems going upward. And I need to watch each of those stems because each of those stems are going to sucker at every juncture between the stem and the leaves. That's almost a daily thing to do. It is not easy. And invariably, most tomato growers will at some point either stop suckering and give up and just tie everything to the stake, and the plant gets really heavy, which is fine, but you have to expect someday that thing's going to come tumbling down. You'll have lots of tomatoes on it. I would say if you extreme sucker and take every sucker off a plant and just grow the central stem, you're only going to have the number of tomatoes that each flower cluster, roughly every 10 inches or so up the plant, produce. And let's say the weather...
Let me go in and get some handkerchiefs, and then we can take our walk.
And let's say the weather is not great for that particular variety as that plant is flowering. You could conceivably get a 10-foot tall plant with 2 tomatoes on it because the blossoms have dropped off every time. Every sucker you leave improves your yield because it means it's going to be flowering at a point where it's going to be happier to pollinate. Each tomato variety reacts to the temperature and humidity a slightly different way. The big German Johnsons and mortgage lifters don't like temperatures over 90 degrees and high humidity, and you'll get lots of blossom drops. So, I would say play around. If you're growing a bunch of plants, sucker them different ways. Suckers are a great way to clone your plant. Maybe if you let a sucker grow 8 inches long or so, stick it in a glass of water, it'll root in about a week, pot it up, and there's your backup plant. Or use suckers to root to give to your neighbors and friends. You're picking your sun golds, and they say, oh, I wish I had a sun gold. Root them a sucker and give them a sun gold plant. They grow fast. So I go into this a lot more. Well, the best way to go into the sucker question is to demonstrate. So I would say in about 2 or 3 weeks, my Instagram lives will be focusing on that. And I found a way to save them to my IGTV channel. So,
terrific.
So people will be able to look through NC Tomato Man's Instagram TV channel, and every week there should be a live 45-minute video where I'm doing a demo of some sort. And I'm going to get lots of sucker questions all summer long. And
that's going to be great.
Yeah, and the other thing you can do is you can top a plant. So let's say you've got a 6-foot stake, and this is something gardeners do very, very, very poorly because we do not like to remove living plant material. We just don't. But you're at the top of your 6-foot stake, and typically gardeners will then let it go up and over and down to the ground again. It kinks the branch. Those tomatoes may not even ripen. Top the plant at the top of the 6-foot stake, and then let a sucker develop to take over the additional fruiting. Tie it to the stake, top that at 6 feet, and then just use sucker management as a way to keep your plant going but you're limiting the height to 6 feet, and you're not ending up with this huge vine that's just going everywhere and pulling your plant down. So there's a few things to think about there.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that, and that was great clarification too. I've definitely had that toppling over experience, and then I've tried topping them too and said, I'm just going with it here, and I need to do that. I'm not going to be afraid anymore.
When Joe Lample came and taped me, we talked about that on the Growing a Greener World episode about topping, and I said, Joe, I'm going to do it better. Here we are in 2020. I still haven't done it well. So this is the year. This is the year that I will top my plants.
All right. And we'll make sure to get people that information about your Instagram account. I definitely want to follow that myself.
Yeah. What time are we at, just out of curiosity?
Yep. I think we've covered the questions. Charlotte, good. I'm going to turn it back to you. It's 10:30 on the dot right now.
Sounds like a good time for me to go out and water my garden.
Amen.
All right. Thank you so much, Craig. There are so many compliments in the chat. I don't know if you can see all that, but people are saying thank you and how much they enjoyed it. Yeah, how much they enjoyed it. I haven't looked at the chat
for a second, so.
Yes, there you go. Love your enthusiasm for gardening and style of presenting. Great information. Thanks so much. Fantastic talks. There's lots of great compliments there. All well desered.
Well,
there was one last question.
Good. Oh, go ahead.
Somebody.
Go ahead.
Somebody wanted to know if your book is available in hardback.
Oh, it is. So when I order books from Story to bring to events and to send to people, typically they'll send the soft cover. And I wasn't even aware there was a hardback until I was at an event one day and somebody brought one to me to sign. I'm like, what is that? So I'm but yeah, I can actually order hardbacks from Story and have a few. I always have a few stored aside, and so if people, let's say people want to get my book from elsewhere and they'd like me to sign it, I have where is it? I have a big roll. Here we go. Demo. I have a big roll of Story Publishing stickers, and I can sign something and mail it, and anybody who ever asks for anything from me gets a bunch of seeds, because I'm a tomato guy with like 50,000 vials of tomato seeds. Everybody has to have some. Or they can order the book for me and we can use PayPal or do a check, whatever. It's just gratifying that, it's been out for 5 years and people seem to still want it. So I was shocked that people still want it after the first 2 months. So this whole thing has just been a kind of a delight to reach gardeners with. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, we were so glad to be able to have you today, and we will definitely have to talk about getting you back for the tomato talk sometime.
It would be a great one. We could actually do that one kind of in the middle of the summer when people are grappling with issues, and maybe do a little online tasting. I guess you could see me actually spit out a tomato I don't like, or I don't know. Thank you, Charlotte. I really hope this worked for everybody. I'm used to being up in front of an audience using my hands and waving around, but if I could keep everybody kind of focused and this worked, I'm gratified. So any feedback people can share with me, things I could do better, things I could do more of, that's kind of where I'm at, is just trying to be able to do these better and better for you guys to be of value. So. Well,
it was excellent. I'll tell you, a testament to your ability to keep people's attention is through the questions. We've still had well over 150 people hanging on through all the questions. We had 261 on the live call when we at the height, and lots of people have continued to stay on to hear all the great information you've shared from the questions.
All right, all you Henderson and Buncombe people and other surrounding counties, get in touch with me. I got plants that need homes. Come and get them.
All right. Well,
thank you, everybody.
Again. Yeah. Have a wonderful, wonderful week to everyone.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll be sending out follow-up information with Craig's contact information and his website and some of the other things that were mentioned today. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.